Hello, and welcome to Chapter 19. This is our first chapter on evolution, and this one focuses on descent with modification. In part one, we're going to learn just a brief history of Darwin's life and the influences, the kind of intellectual influences that helped Darwin come to his realizations. So, starting out with, Darwin was a keen observer of nature, and I wanted to talk to you about some observations that he might have made, observations that you could make, and just kind of get into his mindset. So Lepidopterans, those are moths and butterflies. They have lots of features in common. One of them is the idea of the juvenile being called a caterpillar. And you know the caterpillar, you've learned this since you were in kindergarten probably. Caterpillars don't look that much like the adult version, but some of these caterpillars and versus adults are very just staggering in how different they are. And so lots and lots of distinct features. For example, here is a dead leaf moth caterpillar, and the caterpillar itself looks a lot like a snake. It looks like a snake is about to strike. That's as opposed to the adult. And the adult is how the butterfly gets its name, the dead leaf butterfly, or I'm sorry, the dead leaf moth. And you can see here that this moth does look an awful lot like a dead leaf. So, one of the things that Darwin noticed was that life is endlessly beautiful and just kind of striking in the features of living things. So one of the things that that we can see from living things, and that Darwin also noticed about living things, is that living things tend to have a pretty good fit between their lifestyle and the environment that they live in. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go along. They also, all living things do share many characteristics. We've already talked about some of these characteristics in this class. For example, cells make up all living things, and even to the point of in the last chapter where we talked about how proteins are made and how living things tend to make proteins exactly the same ways. So this unity of life. And the last thing is that there's diversity in life. That means that even though there are many characteristics that living things share, there's also a lot of ways that they're very, very different from each other. When Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species, he did this in 1859. This was a huge leap forward in the way that biologists thought or focused on the diversity of organisms. So we could kind of take a look at how we now think about diversity and how we think about the organization of diversity. But all of these ideas stem from Darwin's original ideas, which is that current species are descendants of ancestral species, and that basically a good way to summarize evolution is to say that that there's descent with modification. So if we look at this branching diagram right here, it's called a phylogeny, and we'll be seeing a lot of these as time goes by for the next few chapters. This is the common ancestor. You can think about time as being on the y-axis, and you can think about like divergence or modification being on the x-axis. So, so as time goes by, organisms become more and more and more different. So the other thing that I want you to know about evolution for now, and again, this whole chapter is on evolution, so we'll be getting a lot of information, is that evolution can be thought of as both a pattern and a process. Like you can think about this pattern here of diversity as, you know, that's your pattern, and you can think about the processes of how they had all these different descendants over time. So, so Darwin's ideas did present a very revolutionary challenge to the ideas that existed before Darwin. But you shouldn't think that Darwin came up with his ideas kind of in a vacuum. He really did work and was influenced by other people's ideas, and he was also influenced by his own observations as he traveled around the globe. So what are some of the roots of his ideas? We're going to start out here with Aristotle. Aristotle lived in about the 3rd century before the current era, and he really viewed species as fixed, and he arranged them on a scale of increased complexity. Now, we don't really think about life as being increased complexity these days, although sometimes we do fall back on that as a kind of an easy way of thinking about things. But really, this idea of things being fixed, they're never changing, each life form is considered perfect as it is and permanent, that was consistent with the Old Testament, which was, of course, written before the Common Era. After Aristotle, actually quite a bit after Aristotle, here we're talking, a millennia later, we could think about another way of classifying species. And Carolus Linnaeus is the founder of modern taxonomy, and all that taxonomy means is the way of naming things. It's a way of classifying and grouping species together into general categories, increasingly more similar categories. He also developed this idea of binomial nomenclature. So if you break down this word binomial, literally means two names, and nomenclature means system of naming. So a binomial nomenclature is a two-name system of naming things. A good example is Homo sapiens. That is, we now call this the genus and the species, that those two words together describe humans, and any two specific words together are unique for all species, and that's their species identification classification. We'll go into more of that a little bit later. So when we think about Linnaeus and we think about this pattern, he also agreed very much with Aristotle, that said that basically things are created as they are. There's a pattern to creation. It's not evolution, and so Aristotle and Linnaeus were pretty much in agreement, even though they lived, 1700 or more years later, apart from each other. But then along came Darwin about 100 years after Linnaeus, and he argued that it was evolutionary relationships that were the basis of Linnaeus's classification. So basically, Darwin said, yeah, Linnaeus was right in these ideas of classification, but his reasoning was wrong. It's not because of creation, but instead because of evolution. Darwin also himself looked at fossils. He relied on the work of other people who looked at fossils, and so the study of fossils is a hugely important thing in understanding the groundwork for Darwin's ideas. Fossils are just like the remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past. We usually do find these in sedimentary rock. And of course, sedimentary rock, you can see here in the Grand Canyon, has all these layers to them. The official word for that is strata. So how do these strata or layers form? Well, as erosion happens, we have water bringing kind of sediment down into lakes or rivers or streams, but there's erosion that's happening, and the erosion builds up layer upon layer upon layer in the water. Now, if something dies, it can be captured in that layer of sediment and be preserved. So the younger strata, the ones that are more recent, are the ones on top, and the ones that are older are lower down. if a river comes through and erodes all of this sedimentary rock here, you can have the fossils being exposed to air again for the first time. The idea of paleontology, which is the study of fossils, was developed back in the late 1700s, early 1800s by a French scientist named Georges Cuvier. And he noticed that the fossils in the strata that were lower down were pretty dissimilar from the modern forms. And so what Cuvier came to acknowledge from observing these fossils is that things go extinct. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. Before Cuvier came along, really the idea of extinction had not been expressed. You know, people thought that the world was created as it is and it's perfect as it is, and that's how things worked. And Cuvier comes along and says, no, you know, a long time ago, things looked a lot differently than they do now, so they must have gone extinct. He didn't believe in evolution, but he did believe in extinction, which is kind of interesting because of course we these days put those two things together. So Cuvier thought that that the boundary between these different extinction events, between these different strata, the boundary there was a catastrophic event that just destroyed lots of species. But then species that were kind of living off to the sides moved in to this new area that was basically had where the extinction event had happened and repopulated it. Now, we know that can happen, but we also now know that extinctions mean that species go extinct and they aren't repopulated. They just become extinct. They no longer exist. A little bit later, and overlapping with Cuvier's early days, was geologist James Hutton, and actually overlapping with Cuvier's later days was geologist Charles Lyell. Both Hutton and Lyell suggested that there were some geological changes that they're kind of ongoing on the Earth, and that they result in gradual changes to the geology of the Earth. Lyell proposed that these processes continued to operate today at the same rate that they happened in the past. And that was actually a big influence on Charles Darwin because he thought, well, you know, if this is true in geology, like, you know, things like the formation of rocks and explosions of volcanoes and things along those lines, if that could happen in rocks, then maybe that could also happen to living things. Darwin was very influenced by a scientist named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And Lamarck was one of the first people to propose the idea of evolutionary change and how it might occur. Now, I want to back up here and say that for the most part, Lamarck's ideas were not supported by evidence. But the important thing here is that he came up with a way that he thought that evolution could occur. And what he hypothesized was that species evolve through use and disuse of body parts. So that what his idea was called was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And let me just underline that for you so that you can see the actual name of his hypothesis. The inheritance of acquired characteristics. Once again, this idea was not supported by experimental evidence, but so the idea here is that this tree could be trimmed into a certain shape, and that shape is the shape that would be passed on to the next generation. And of course, that if you think about it like in terms of humans, that doesn't make too much sense. So if you keep your hair long, does that mean your baby is going to be born with long hair? Or if you if you exercise and build your muscles, does that mean that your child will be born with big muscles? So there's where some of the flaws come in with Lamarck's hypothesis. So as I had said before, Darwin's own travels also influenced him. Now, Darwin was just consumed with nature his entire life. He was very fascinated with nature. When he went to college, he first studied medicine, and it says unsuccessfully here because Darwin failed out of medical school. It was something that he wasn't that interested in. And then he went to theology school. That's the study of religion at Cambridge University. And he did graduate with a degree in theology. After he graduated, he took on a position as a naturalist for a 5-year trip around the world on the boat, the HMS Beagle. And you can see a picture of the HMS Beagle right here, a painting of it. And here's a young Charles Darwin. So he was actually hired as a naturalist in part because of his religious background and in part because of his consuming interest in nature. And most of Darwin's friends knew about his interest in nature. He would spend a lot of time outside, and he was well known for that. So the 5-year voyage started in Great Britain and spent a lot of time along the coast of South America. They actually found a way around this passage around here, and then up the western coast of South America, finally spending some time in the very famous Galapagos Islands. And then, since the world is round, they went from the Galapagos Islands to New Zealand and Australia, the Malay Archipelago, a little bit of time off of the Cape of Good Hope, off the southern tip of Africa, and then back to Europe, back to Great Britain. Again, this took 5 years. And during this time, Darwin frequently got off of the boat and explored the land around him. On this voyage, Darwin observed and collected thousands of plants and animals. He also observed fossils of species that were similar to the organisms that he actually saw in real life. This is a gigantic extinct rat-like animal found in Argentina and South America. And it's similar to one of the very much smaller animals like the capybara that lives in that area these days. So he's describing these living things. He's sending back samples back to England. He is observing these fossils. And this, of course, has a huge, huge impact on him. Along with reading Charles Lyell's book, which I vaguely talked about earlier, remember Charles Lyell, the geologist? He actually brought this book with him on his travels, The Principles of Geology. And again, this idea of earthquakes and uplift, the idea that organisms that lived on the bottom of the ocean could be found at the top of a mountain was very interesting to Darwin. And he concluded, much like the people who lived during the scientists who lived at the same time as him, that the Earth must be much older than the few thousand years that was traditionally thought of as being accurate from extrapolations from the Bible. And of course, Darwin did spend quite a bit of time in the Galapagos Islands. He was very interested in the distribution of species, particularly birds, during his stop at the Galapagos Islands. One of the things he realized is that species from South American mainland were the ones that seemed to be the most similar to the ones on the island, and so had probably colonized the Galapagos Islands. After they had gotten to the Galapagos Islands, it is then that they diverged from the original species that had colonized the islands. He came to realize that the reason that these organisms diverged on these islands is because they became adapted to the specific environment that existed on the islands. He came to realize that new species and the process by which adaptation happens are very closely related processes. Since Darwin came up with his ideas, biologists have seen that the diversity of Galapagos finches, they did arise from an ancestor that lived on the coast of South America a long time ago, and that they adapted to various environments. We will talk a little bit about that in later chapters. This is the only diagram that Darwin drew in his entire book. And this is how he thought that that evolution occurred. And you can see here he wrote, "I think." And this is how he thought evolution happened. So he did publish, he wrote an essay on this concept of natural selection as the mechanism of how descent with modification happens. He wrote this essay, but he didn't actually publish it. And just so you have this definition in your notes right now, natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable traits, these traits have to be inheritable, those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce, and so pass those favorable traits on to their offspring. So 1844, Darwin writes his essay. He doesn't really get it published. He doesn't really want to get the notoriety associated with like saying things that might disprove what it says in the Bible. And he was pretty content to just kind of leave things that way for a while, until along comes this guy right here. And this should be in bold. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. So in 1858, this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, writes a letter to Darwin. And the letter that he writes, this thing's like 14 pages long. And in it, he basically presents the same information that Darwin had written about in this essay that he wrote on natural selection, what was that, like 14 years earlier. So like Darwin starts to freak out a little bit, and he goes to Lyell because by this time they're friends, and he says to Lyell, "Hey, there's this guy, this Wallace kid. He has the same idea that I have, and I think it's time to publish this whole thing." So in 1858, Darwin publishes Wallace's letter and the essay that he had written back in 1844. He has them published in this journal called the Linnean Society of London. And so after this publication happens, then within the year, Darwin writes the book that we're so familiar with, which is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So he published that within a year. We're going to dive into these big ideas that Darwin had in a little bit in part 2.